Today, we're going to be talking about how to enhance your intelligence. And this has a lot to do with your success in life. Psychologists tell us that the job that you get out of college is directly related to your IQ. And there's a lot of other things directly related to your IQ, including how long you live. In fact, in the new scientific studies, they're now having to put that in there. In fact, just last week, a study was done and published in the journal Circulation showing that IQ was the second most important factor to how long you're going to live, over another lifestyle factor that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So intelligence is related also to longevity and how long your success will be. What is the definition of IQ? It's your capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. All three of those things. And it's not just your capacity to learn. You have to retain it. That means you have to have a memory. The temporal lobe of the brain has to be working. And you also have to be able to apply that knowledge in your daily life. And it's often measured by an IQ test. How many of you have had an IQ test in this room? Wow, I would say the majority of Australians have not had their IQ measured. And I'm wondering why. But I won't go into the possibilities as to why you haven't had yours measured. It's related somewhat to academic performance. Not completely. There is something called EQ, emotional intelligence, that's also very much related to academic performance, and that has to do with motivation. Motivation is separate from IQ. But if you have motivation and you have IQ, it's very directly related to your GPA or your academic performance. Now, there are some myths about IQ that need to be cleared up here today in this subject about intelligence. One of the myths is genetics that is all that matters. Now, we do know genetics is important. And it is clear that if your mother and father had high IQ, there's a greater chance that you'll have it. But it's not at all the sole determinant of IQ. Another myth is there's nothing you can do about it after age 18. And one of the reasons why that myth is perpetuated is many 18-year-olds in America have had their IQ measured. Normally you have it measured your junior or senior year of high school. And then they will, out of curiosity, try to measure it after age 30 because they've learned so much, they're just sure that their IQ has improved. And then when they take the IQ test, they find out it's the same in most instances. It's the same not because we're not measuring knowledge. Yes, that 30-year-old has accumulated a lot of knowledge, but it's not just accumulated knowledge. We're measuring the capacity to learn, retain, and apply new knowledge. And 30-year-olds often don't have that much greater than what they did at age 18. However, there are significant exceptions. I remember a young man who actually came in to understanding the full message of the Bible as a result of health in our town of Ardmore, Oklahoma. He came in with a vegetarian restaurant there and inquired more about the truths of God. He was interested in his personal health, and he adopted that lifestyle, the vegetarian lifestyle, and then he ended up becoming a fully baptized member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But he had an issue, and part of his issue was IQ. Nice-looking man, tall, handsome, great personality, but he did not do well in school. He had learned enough to learn the gospel and accept that, but he had a desire to really excel. And I remember talking to him as he was coming to me, wondering how he could excel more in school. And I told him, maybe first you ought to go to a place like Mission College where you can learn more of the deep truths of the Word of God. And he did that. He went there for 6 months, and he enjoyed his time there. But I remember calling the director of that school, Louis Torres, about halfway through the course, and I said, tell me how Les is doing. He says, I'm not sure he's going to make it. He is struggling. And he's getting some of the lowest grades in our classes, but he's barely surviving. And he says, I'm hoping that he's going to pull through. And at the end, he did pull through. He actually raised his grades enough. He wasn't by any means in the top half of his class. He was in the bottom half of his class at Mission College. But he learned enough to become a Bible worker, and he went right into Bible work in Colorado. And he was a successful Bible worker. He had that winning personality and that nice appearance that went along with it, and that helped to make up maybe for some of the deficits that he had had as far as his IQ was concerned. But I remember about a year after being in Bible work, he came back to me in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and he says, you know, what I'd really like to do is to incorporate the health message of the gospel full time. I'd really like to become a doctor. And I'm thinking, Les, there's no way. There is no way. I mean, in America, I don't know how it is in Australia, but on those who try to become doctors, less than 2% will actually make it into medical school. And so you have to have a certain IQ to even be able to withstand that because of all of the information that is thrown at you in a 4-year time period that you have to learn. But he says, you know, I really have that desire. So I told him, well, listen to this. I gave him a presentation that I'm about ready to give you. And I said, incorporate it and really work on it for about a year. And I wasn't sure if it was going to be successful or not, but he had that desire, and I didn't want to say no to that desire. And so he incorporated it. He followed every aspect of the message. And then he went into the pre-med part of things, where he took chemistry and biology and physics. And at first it was a little rough, but then he started to excel more and more. And then he took his MCAT, and now he is in medical school. He made it, the top 2%, and he's having a good time in medical school. So it's a myth that there's nothing that you can do after age 18, because he was over 20 by the time he first came into the message. Another myth, people that are highly intelligent are generally irritating to be around. That has actually been studied, and the studies show that although some of them are irritating to be around, they're no more likely to be irritable than people of low IQ or average IQ. So irritableness has a lot more to do with EQ than IQ, and they're not necessarily related. Another myth, people that are highly intelligent lack common sense. And this, of course, is true in some. Albert Einstein, I think, was a good example, and that's maybe how the myth was perpetuated. Albert Einstein would frequently get lost on his way home. And he would just forget about where he was at. He was deep in thought, and then he'd have to say, wait a minute, where am I? I just passed my house some time ago. And he would have to find it again. And then another myth, you can't improve it, so why try? I think we've already dispelled that myth because it can be improved upon. So let's talk about how to improve intelligence in children and in adults. Now, what I'm going to be presenting to you are things that you can do now to improve your intelligence. And, we have limited time. One of the things I would like to talk about is how you can raise your kids to be high IQ. There's an environment that's actually started in the prenatal and the natal influences, and then the first 5 years of life that are critically important to how high an IQ your own children will have. But that's a different topic, somewhat related, but it is a different topic. But that will be for another time. One is to avoid toxins. Toxins to the brain will adversely affect IQ. And alcohol actually affects a certain portion of the brain before it affects any other portion of the brain. It's called the frontal lobe of the brain. This is the area of spirituality, morality, and the will. It's the area where we make our decisions. It's the judgment area of the brain, the analytical portion of the brain. And when alcohol is on board, in fact, in Australia, the legal limit of alcohol intoxication is 0.05%. And I know you have a major problem with this in this country. because I was leaving the airport. I came into Sydney the first time on Sunday night, and the taxi driver picked me up, and the police had made a line out of the airport measuring everyone that came out and having them blow into a machine to make sure alcohol wasn't on board. Everyone had to blow before they could go. And this taxi driver fortunately passed the test. I was glad to see that. But studies show that if you're at 0.05% and a policeman pulls you over and you're right at that legal limit, will you be able to walk a straight line? You actually will. You can walk a straight line. In fact, if you're skilled at doing so, you can hit a curveball out of a baseball park at that limit. So why is it then that you're 10 times as likely to get into an automobile accident? It's not your coordination. Your cerebellum is working fine. The problem is your judgment. And that's what happened to Princess Di's driver. No one recognized that he was drunk. He was walking straight lines. He was conversing normally. But he attempted to negotiate a turn in a tunnel at a speed that was impossible to negotiate. That wreck has been analyzed, and it's been found that the best race car driver in the world would not have been able to successfully negotiate that turn at that speed. And thus he lost his life and others lost their life as well. Now, once alcohol is out of the system, the next day you're able to drive again. Does driving involve critical, abstract, difficult decision making? No. If it did, 16-year-olds would not be allowed to drive in the world. The reason why 16 and 18 and 20-year-olds can drive is because it's a fairly simplistic thing. It doesn't require a lot of complex thinking and analysis. But studies show once alcohol is on board, it takes 2 weeks for critical abstract thinking to come back. One of the reasons why it's best to totally abstain from alcohol so that the frontal lobe can be in tip-top shape. Another substance that affects the frontal lobe of the brain in a more subtle area is nicotine, but it's clear nicotine has a suppressant effect on the frontal lobe of the brain. Lead also is a toxin that affects IQ, one of the reasons why you don't want to have your kids play with toys that are laced with lead. And the most commonly consumed drug in Australia also has a role to play. Anyone want to guess what it is? Caffeine. Caffeine actually affects the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe of the brain, blocks the adenosine receptors. It also has too much of another chemical, acetylcholine, available. Acetylcholine, actually what it does is destroys the enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which makes too much acetylcholine available. And this is why people under the influence of caffeine feel stimulated. Pavlov studied this out. Typists actually can type a little bit faster under the influence of caffeine, but they make 10 times as many errors. And recently there was a study done on caffeine and gossip. Now, the definition of gossip that was used in this study was sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. And studies show when you have caffeine on board, you're significantly more likely to do that than when you don't have caffeine on board. And that's simply due to that loss of brake in the frontal lobe of the brain that comes from blocking those adenosine receptors. Now, this information is caught up with the National Football League. In America, we just had the biggest, most watched sporting event of the year, the Super Bowl, occur. And interestingly, those linemen and those blockers, the one trying to protect the quarterback as well as the ones that are trying to get to the quarterback, are told to consume caffeine. But there's one individual on that field that is told to consume no caffeine. And guess who that is? It's actually the quarterback. And the quarterback's the one that has to get away from those people that are juiced up with caffeine. So why shouldn't he have caffeine on board? There's a lot of information coming into that quarterback in about 3 seconds, and he has to make a wise decision. It requires an active frontal lobe of the brain to make that wise decision. And studies show when caffeine is on board, he's more likely to make the wrong decision. And so if it is true in regards to NFL quarterbacks, with the decisions that we're having to make moment by moment, analyzing information and making wise decisions, it would make sense for us also to go caffeine-free. Another thing that has to do with IQ is breathing. This study was done at Harvard University. For children, healthy lungs may mean healthier scores on tests of memory, learning, and intelligence. Researchers at Harvard University examined data on 165 Boston children who had been followed since birth. At the age of 6, the children had their lung function tested. At age 9, they completed standard tests of memory, learning, ability, and intelligence. And the researchers found that for each increase in the children's lung function performance, there was a corresponding increase in their cognitive test scores. This previously was shown in adults to be the case, young adults, and now it's shown to be the case also in children. And part of this that is emphasized is deep breathing. In fact, it was interesting, when this study came out, I actually plugged in the phrase deep breathing into Ellen White's CD-ROM. And I was going to show that to you. I think it's actually a hidden slide. I don't know if anyone up there might be able to unhide the slide. But interestingly, what she stated was those that participate in exercises for deep breathing will have an advantage. And she recommended that every educational institution actually institute in children the exercise of deep breathing. Here it is. The one who sits and stands erect is more likely than others to breathe properly. But the teacher should impress upon his pupils the importance of deep breathing, show how the healthy action of the respiratory organs, assisting the circulation of the blood, invigorates the whole system, excites the appetite, promotes digestion, and induces sound, sweet sleep, thus not only refreshing the body, but soothing and tranquilizing the mind. And while the importance of deep breathing is shown, the practice should be what? Insisted upon. Let exercises be given which will promote this, and see that the habit becomes established. And so this is why even posture, and even sitting in an environment where you're in classes all day, or you're at AYC, it's important to take those slow, deep breaths. Actually, it will oxygenate the brain better, and you'll have better frontal lobe as well as better retention, better temporal lobe function. Now, there's one lifestyle habit that's been shown to be the most critically associated, at least at Brigham Young University, 40,000 student body, in regards to their GPA. This lifestyle factor is very much related to melatonin. And melatonin comes about as a result of darkness and being in a dark environment. As you can see on the screen, once darkness hits, melatonin starts to spike and peak. It'll peak around 2 o'clock in the morning, and when light comes in the room in the morning, it shuts down again. Melatonin is very much related to your ability to retain the information that you learned that day. Now, if you go to bed 2 hours later than 9 o'clock, or if you go to bed at midnight, you'll decrease the area under that curve by about 50%. So you'll have less melatonin output as a result of being a late nighter. And what Brigham Young University found out is the lifestyle factor most connected to GPA was early to bed, early to rise. Interestingly, Ellen White was also ahead of her time on this. She said, sleep is worth far more before than after midnight. 2 hours good sleep before 12 o'clock is worth more than 4 hours after 12 o'clock. I had actually seen that statement after my freshman year of college. I was in pre-med at Andrews University, and I had taken I'd taken general chemistry and calculus. Those were the two hard classes for my freshman year. In my sophomore year, I had lined up to take organic chemistry, foundations of biology, physics for scientists and engineers, which is a calculus-based physics, and then quantitative analysis, another advanced chemistry course. So I had classes all morning, and then every afternoon I had a lab associated with one of those classes. So Monday was physics lab, Tuesday biology, etc. And my advisor, Dr. Wilkins, said, Neil, if you want to go to medical school, I would recommend you not do this. You need to get good grades, and one or two of these subjects is hard enough, but all four of them? Well, I said, the problem is, Dr. Wilkins, I've been looking at all the subjects I want to take, and I can't get them all in unless I do this year like that. I said, can I try it? And then if I'm not doing so well, maybe I can drop a class or two so that I'm not adversely affected in regards to getting into medical school. And he says, well, you can try it, but I wouldn't recommend it. Well, I was used to going to bed at 11:30, and I changed my bedtime. I actually, after class, I remember I'm having class all day long. I worked in the evening. I actually worked as a tutor for the freshman class. And my work got out at 9 p.m. And so the only study time I had was in the morning before class. So I was used to going to bed at 11:30. Now I went to bed at 9 o'clock. I got up at 4 a.m. The first thing I did was read spiritual material and spend some time with the Lord. And then I would spend just a few minutes, it was never more than 60 or 90 minutes, studying all of those subjects. And then I would go out for a 3-mile run around the track. I would make it to breakfast, and then I would make it to my 7:30 class as the bell was ringing. And that was my study time. And at the end of that semester, my GPA was 4.0, far higher than it was my freshman year with easier classes. And so indeed, melatonin is critically important. I can tell you from personal experience, early to bed, early to rise makes a person, do you have this saying in Australia? Healthy, wealthy, and wise. And actually there are studies showing that. In our business community, where the top business leaders come and meet, or when they meet, is always early in the morning. They're early to bed, early to risers. They'll love to meet at 6 o'clock in the morning to plan how the town is going to run. There's no one else there. It's quiet. They can have that thinking time there. And virtually the only one that have the money who are not doing that is the entertainment industry. The entertainment industry is linked with major depression. And the more depressed you are, the more you feel better as you are sleep deprived. That's one of the reasons why the late nighters tend to be associated there with the entertainment industry. Unfortunately, they can also get on a program. They come to us, and within 7 days, they're early to bed, early to risers. We can phase shift them with light therapy and with proper sleep. Diet also has a role to play in regards to IQ. High-carb, low-fat diet will improve weight loss, enhance mood, speed thinking, and while both a high and low-carb diet seem to boost the speed of cognitive processing, the interesting result that compared to the high-carb diet, subjects consuming the low-carb diet had a smaller improvement. So just being on a more lean portion of food can be helpful, but it's much better to be on the high-carb, low-fat diet. And that's what the frontal lobe desires for optimal function, is a diet higher in carbohydrates. What foods have carbohydrates in them? Carbohydrates are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function, but carbohydrates are present in fruits, vegetables, nuts, and grains. Interestingly, the original diet in Genesis chapter 1. Ellen White quotes those 4 food groups and says they impart a strength, a power of endurance, and a vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex and stimulating diet. And so there is an advantage to a diet that is plant-based. In fact, in another place, she talks about the adverse effect of food high in protein and high in fat, virtually no carbohydrate, which is primarily your meat food. Meat is a carbohydrate-deficient food. One of the reasons why it doesn't come out on top as far as the best for brain function. Sugar is a carbohydrate. I remember in the 3rd grade, after the researchers found out that carbs were good for the frontal lobe, I was handed a candy bar, and I said, the person who handed it to me said, "Here, have some brain food." And I said, really? And they said, yeah, carbs are good for the brain. This candy bar is loaded with it. Should be great for your brain. Well, I wondered about that. But I didn't, just a few years later, it was studied in Iowa and then in other places. Actually, a high sugar diet impairs frontal lobe function in school-age children significantly. In fact, it makes over a grade letter difference performance in studies, particularly if they involve having to think. Now, if it's just memory, you can do all right in most cases, but if you're having to think about the problem and come up with a solution to it, it makes a powerful difference. One of the reasons why is when we eat a candy bar, our pancreas thinks we've had a large amount of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables because our blood sugar spikes. Then it cranks out a high amount of insulin, and within 20 minutes, we're in the mildly hypoglycemic phase, and it takes 4 hours for the frontal lobe to fully recuperate from that. And so at first, the person feels a little bit hungry. They snack again, but they're still under that 4-hour recovery time. If they're taking their test during that time, it does make a difference in adverse performance. Arachidonic acid also decreases the synthesis and storage of acetylcholine, an important neurotransmitter in the frontal lobe of the brain, and it's primarily present in flesh foods, and one of the reasons why Pavlov showed that meat and intelligence are not related. Ellen White says this: eating much flesh will diminish intellectual activity. Students would accomplish much more in their studies if they did what? Never tasted meat. When the animal part of the human nature is strengthened by meat eating, the intellectual power diminishes proportionately. Now, interestingly, there was a study done in Great Britain not long ago on the opposite effect. In other words, IQ and its relationship to vegetarianism. What this study showed in Great Britain was that children with high IQs are more likely to become vegetarians when they grow up. Study of more than 8,000 men and women aged 30 whose IQs had been measured when they were 10 showed that the higher the IQ, the greater the odds of becoming a vegetarian. For each 15-point increase in IQ in the study, the likelihood of being a vegetarian rose by 38%. Even after adjustment to factors such as social class and education, the link was still consistent. And so if you don't have much time, when someone asks you why you're a vegetarian, you can give them the simple 2-word answer: high IQ. Now, it's not just a plant-based diet that can be helpful or just a vegetarian diet. Some vegetarian diets can be unhealthy. You know, even eating or drinking soft drinks is part of a vegetarian diet, but it's not the healthiest. And also, it depends on what else we're getting with that vegetarian diet. This was a study done by Bruce Taylor in New York. Bruce Taylor was a pathologist. There were medical students in his medical school that wanted to publish some research so they could graduate from medical school. And so they decided to feed rabbits and monkeys 100% cholesterol and see what would happen to their arteries. But they needed the cholesterol, so they came to him to get it. And he says, well, it's been over there in the corner. It's been there for a while, but it's nothing but pure cholesterol. If you want to feed pure cholesterol to them, go ahead. So they did, and within a few short weeks, all of them had a decrease in activity of their brain, and they began to actually have strokes, small strokes, and some of them major strokes and major heart attacks. And they came back to Dr. Taylor and said, is there anything else in there besides cholesterol? He said, no, pure cholesterol. They mentioned the results. He said, cholesterol is bad, but it shouldn't have been that bad in that quick a time. And then he began to think, and he recognized the cholesterol he had given him had been in a bucket that had been exposed to the air. It had become discolored. And then he decided to do something else. Let's feed pure cholesterol to rabbits and monkeys that have never been exposed to the air. And so instead of being discolored, it was a clear substance, clear white. And he found out none of them developed any atherosclerosis with that. Then he decided to do something else. He fed food to the monkeys, and within 24 hours, he would count the dead cells in their aorta from the oxidized cholesterol. It's the oxidized cholesterol that's the most damaging. Anyone want to guess what the most harmful food was to monkey blood vessels? in Dr. Taylor's study? Number one, custards. Now, what are custards? What are custards made out of? Milk, sugar, and eggs. When you mix up cholesterol in a sugar environment, and eggs are particularly loaded, you're going to oxidize that cholesterol and cause significant damage. Doesn't take long, within 24 hours. What's the most commonly consumed custard in America? Or in Australia? I think it's the most commonly consumed one here as well. It's actually good old-fashioned ice cream. And is one of the reasons why it's good that there are ice creams cropping up that have no cholesterol. You know, there's the banana ice cream that you can put through the frozen bananas in the Champion juicer. There's Tofrutti. And last year I came across a food manufacturer. Actually, he read our book, Proof Positive, totally changed his life. He was having a lot of health problems. He was a multimillionaire rancher up in Montana. And I was speaking in his area. I didn't even know he existed, but he found out I was there. He came there and wanted me to take me to his house. I ended up spending the night with him and his family, a great guy. But his ice cream was the best that I had ever had. And he has 32 flavors, one more than Baskin-Robbins. And it's not soy-based, it's oatmeal-based. And his problem, after I ate it, and my boys were there too, they were raving about it. Everyone raves about his ice cream. He told me about his problem of naming the ice cream. You can't call it ice cream if it doesn't have dairy in it in America. And of course, this was better than any ice cream that any of us had eaten, including the dairy ice cream. And but a week later, he called me up and he said, I found out the name. I woke up with it in the middle of the night. He's going to call it, we can't say it's ice cream. And he's also come out with something to compete against number 2 and 3 as well. Number 2, the most damaging was pancake mix. Pancake mix is primarily powdered eggs, cholesterol, or oxidized cholesterol from the powdered eggs, and it was tied with 3, Parmesan cheese, the powdered cheese, and that's not a misprint. Lard was number 3 as well. They're both tied for number 3 as being the worst as far as harmful within 24 hours to the aorta and what they can also do to the brain blood cells. Now I'm going to ask our team also to go ahead and unhide the next slide that I had in this presentation. Because it's interesting, again, far ahead of her time was Ellen White on this subject. Before Bruce Taylor came up with it, there were some questions in regard to that. But she said, especially harmful are the what? Especially harmful are the custards and puddings in which milk, eggs, and sugar are the chief ingredients. The free use of milk and sugar together should be what? Avoided. Far ahead of her time. Physical exercise, also critically important in regards to IQ. And it's their aerobic physical exercise that seems to be the most beneficial. But there's another type of exercise that's helpful as well. This study showed working with one's own hands in a real-world 3D environment is imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development, Dr. Eric Sigmund says. With woodwork, metalwork, craft, music, or car mechanic classes dropped by many schools and children wanting to play computer games at home, the Western world is becoming a software instead of a screwdriver society. And there are problems with that, he mentions. Research is showing that increasing time spent in the virtual world of computers is displacing hands-on play and hands-on learning. 3D learning allows young people to experience how the world works in practice, to gain an understanding of materials and processes, and to make informed judgments about abstract concepts. And so working with your hands in a 3D world environment actually improves cognitive function, improves IQ. He did studies in regards to even engineering students. Engineering students are starting out at an all-time low because they have difficulty in conceptualizing these things coming from their software society instead of yesteryear's screwdriver society. Ellen White also talks about the importance of work and particularly fast work in regards to mental acuity. She says there's no excuse for slow bungling at work of any character. When one is always at work and the work is never done, it is because mind and heart are not put into the labor. The one who is slow and who works at a disadvantage should realize that these are faults to be corrected. He needs to exercise his mind in planning how to use the time as to secure the best results. By tact and method, some will accomplish as much in 5 hours as others do in 10. And so part of this work is the aerobic part of it as well. Getting some of it may be mindless per se, but we have to plan and we have to do by tact and method. But this mindless, fast work of the hands actually helps to develop the brain and keep that brain smart. And that's why at Weimar Center of Health and Education, where we're leading out in an academy and college and a lifestyle health center, physical labor is a critical ingredient for every faculty member and for every student that's there, whether it's garden work or other type of physical labor work. And you know who we've had the hardest time with in regards to getting that labor done? It's not been the students. It's actually been the faculty. A lot of our faculty are not used to that sort of thing, and they tell me, you know, there's intense classes I'm having to teach, I'm having to prepare, don't have the time for it. But then when we tell them this is a must as far as Weimar, they go out and do it, and they come back with smiles on their faces, and they feel refreshed, and they talk about how much more efficient they are in preparing for their classes. Something critical about regular physical labor. Well, hypnosis will also counteract IQ. In fact, this comes from a hypnosis textbook. Hypnosis attempts to cancel out frontal lobe functions and bring people into a trance in which they are highly suggestible. This is most easily accomplished by training the eyes to focus in on one object, the best object being a little flickering light. The person will record information and duties without interpretation or without frontal lobe activity. Now, a lot of people may not realize it, but they could have a hypnotic instrument in their own home. What trains the eyes to focus in on one object and flicker? Yes, and what produces that flicker is the rapid scene of reference change. Now, you may be watching this on television on Three Angels Broadcasting Network. And if you are, rest assured it's not going to suppress your frontal lobe. Do you know why it won't? The average scene is not changing every 3 seconds like it does in movies and entertainment television. We sit people down in front of their favorite TV program, and within 90 seconds to at most 3 minutes, they're no longer in beta wave activity. They're in alpha wave rhythm, which is a hypnotic rhythm. Their memory is still working, their emotions are working, they can laugh and cry with the scene, but they're no longer putting it in the appropriate subsets. And this is why they can laugh at hideous things that if they occurred in real life, they would be appalling, because of the hypnotic state that they're in. There are 17 detrimental effects on the frontal lobe of the brain that entertainment television has been proven to do. Over 3,000 studies have been done on it. Over 300 books have been written on the subject. And they all show a decline in frontal lobe function. It decreases interest in learning. It decreases interest in reading. Decrease in IQ scores. Decrease in academic performance. Decrease in discernment. Increase in daydreaming. And a decrease in creative ingenuity. In fact, one of our professors at one of our colleges, Columbia Union College, who taught communications for years, people would come because they wanted to be experts in the media. And sometimes they would fail his communications class, and they would say, this is what I want to do for my life. I'm failing. And he would tell them one piece of information that would help them. He would tell them to go home and stop watching television and movies, and in 1 year come back and take his class. Students would do that, and they would come back and get an A. Interestingly, the top Hollywood producers who design the sets and the movies and everything about it themselves don't watch entertainment television because they know it's going to suppress their creativity. And they'll tell you about this. They'll tell you about it in interviews, etc. They might watch what someone else has done for 90 seconds to at most 3 minutes, but they're not going to watch a full-length movie because of what it's going to do in suppressing their frontal lobe of their brain in regards to creativity. This study done not long ago and published Columbia University and published in the journal Pediatrics, the more TV adolescents watch, the more likely they are to develop attention and learning problems and do poorly in school in the long run. The amount of TV kids watched when they were 14 was positively linked with having attention problems later, not doing homework, being bored at school, not finishing high school, and hating school, the researchers found. 14-year-olds who added one more daily hour of TV doubled their risk of academic failure at age 16. And unfortunately, it's not just a problem of teenagers, it can be a problem of college students as well. And what we are finding out, entertainment television does suppress the frontal lobe of the brain. You can see it on PET scans, etc. And this is the area where spirituality, morality, and the will are centered. This is the area where the Lord can communicate with us through the Holy Spirit. But interestingly, what we're also finding out is what suppresses the frontal lobe seems to also affect physical health and longevity. For instance, when the frontal lobe is suppressed, far greater risk you're going to have an anxiety disorder or depression come about as a result. This study was done in Australia and published just 1 month ago from a study in Victoria. Compared with adults who watched less than 2 hours of TV a day, those who watched more than 4 hours had a 46% higher risk of death from all causes and an 80% higher risk of cardiovascular death during the 6-year study period. Each hour spent in front of the TV per day raised a person's risk of death from cardiovascular disease by 18% and the risk of cancer by 9%. In fact, the study's authors were stymied. At first, they thought it was the sitting, but then they realized it wasn't just the sitting. The pattern held even after the researchers took into account the education level, the overall health of the participants, their age, whether they smoked, their cholesterol, and blood pressure. What's more, exercise doesn't necessarily make up for the long seasons in front of the tube. Dunstan and his colleagues figured into their analysis how much study participants exercised when they compared groups of adults who exercised the same amount but watched varying amounts of TV. Those who watched more TV were still at a higher risk of dying during the 6-year study. Reading or doing homework doesn't seem to be associated with risk factors in regards to death. So it's not just sitting, because reading homework and sitting in a class is not associated with it. And thus, notice that last quote, we're not sure if it's the sedentary behavior itself or something inherent about or associated with TV viewing. And I think what it's clear by other studies is that association is what suppresses frontal lobe function is bad for the health and can even increase the risk of cancer and heart disease. Music also has a role to play in regards to IQ. I could go through a number of studies showing that even this 11-year-old learning to play the cello at an early age increased his IQ as a result of that. Having your children learn an instrument is important. Music enters the brain through its emotional regions, which include the temporal lobe and limbic system. From there, some kinds of music tend to produce a frontal lobe response that influences the will, moral worth, and reasoning power. The type of music that's shown to be most beneficial is the traditional classical music. This was a picture that I took myself at the Dallas Symphony during the Christmas concert not long ago. Beautiful music. It's sold out 12 nights in a row. They don't have to advertise it. There's an upsurge of classical music occurring around the globe simply because of, part of the reason is the study showing the benefit as far as organizing the brain is concerned and in regards to IQ. In fact, interestingly, other kinds of music will evoke very little, if any, frontal lobe response, but will produce a large emotional response with very little logical or moral interpretation. And that's characterized by the syncopated rock and roll rhythms that are prevalent in our day, showing that upbeat music is not necessarily uplifting music. In fact, last week I was speaking in Melbourne, and the person who took me picked me up from the airport is getting his PhD in sports psychology at the university down there. He's into sports himself, but he's very interested in what can enhance the sports performance. And so he has done, along with his professors, some study on music and sports performance. And the first study he did was on accuracy of shooting a pistol and music associated with it. The first music they used was the type of music that you would normally see on TV when people are shooting pistols for sport. What type of music would that be? It's the syncopated rock and roll rhythms that are there. And they would play that to them, and they found out it decreased their accuracy significantly. They tended to be all over the place when that music was played during or before. Then they played them more peaceful classical music, or even more energetic classical music, and they found out it increased their accuracy significantly, multiple-fold, as a result of music. And so music can organize the brain. The Baroque music by Bach, Handel seems to be very beneficial. There's other composers like Respighi, and even more modern composers that write in the classical realm that are helpful. Fortunately, most of our hymns are actually classical music. They were written by classical composers. The hymns can be a very beneficial thing as far as the brain is concerned. This study, 24 university students performed 2 tests of attention. Positive moods were induced by playing Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3, and negative moods by a Prokofiev piece played at half speed. Now that tells you something else. Not all classical is helpful. Prokofiev doesn't have that melodious classical. And particularly when it's played, it will induce problems to the brain, but when it's played at half speed, it's even more problematic. And it will induce depression in anybody who listens to it. Interestingly, the opposite will be in fact in Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. Even if you don't have a relish for classical music, if you listen to Bach's Brandenburg Concerto, it will actually improve your frontal lobe and your happiness scale. To produce a neutral mood, participants read a series of facts and figures about Canada. Hopefully there aren't any Canadians here, but if there are, that's how they induce the neutral mood. The study showed when they were in a positive mood, participants scored higher on a remote associates task, a measure of creative thinking. When feeling happy, Anderson explained, your attentional window is actually bigger. It's like looking through a big window versus a small window. And so creativity, along with frontal lobe function, significantly improved. Alvin Toffler comes from the very secular perspective, as many of these scientists do, but he states this: constant stimulation of the senses shuts down the analytical processes. And this, I think, underscores one of the reasons why we are seeing all-time high rates of depression in the Western world, to a large degree. We have more fun things to do than ever before in human history, and if these fun things prevented or treated depression, what should we see? We should see the lowest rates of depression ever recorded in human history, but yet we have higher rates. And part of those higher rates is a lot of the entertainment and fun things, including the music, video games, other forms of entertainment, actually suppress the analytical processes. As Alvin Toffler says, constant stimulation of the senses shuts down the analytical processes and ultimately shuts down the ability to face life rationally. What will happen, he says, this leads to escape techniques that involve withdrawal, apathy, and rejection of disciplined thinking when faced with difficult duties and decisions. And what sets it all off? It's that constant stimulation. So you not only have the syncopated rock and roll music, you have the sensual images on the screen, moving in rapid succession. We call it MTV, showing a very profound effect in regards to reducing frontal lobe function and a profound adverse effect in regards to IQ as well. Well, the brain is a lot like a muscle. If we don't use it, what's going to happen? We're going to lose it. And so we actually need to use our analytical portions of our brain to preserve as well as to expand our intelligence. There's a book written called Education by the pen of Ellen White. Secretary of Education in California recently said it's far ahead of its time, and if the state of California would apply these principles to their educational system, they would lead the world in education. No doubt, a lot of the statements that she has made have been now shown to be true in educational studies. But in the middle of this book, she says, as a means of intellectual training, the Bible is more effective than any other book or all other books combined. This is why the complete AYC experience can actually enhance your IQ, because we are studying the Bible. She says the greatness of its themes, the dignified simplicity of its utterances, the beauty of its imagery quicken and uplift the thoughts as nothing else can. No other study can impart such mental power as does the effort to grasp the stupendous truths of Revelation. The mind thus brought in contact with the thoughts of the infinite cannot but expand and strengthen. And so I ask you, actually, this is not a comprehensive lecture on improving your IQ. I'm reaching the highlights. But if you want to get a more comprehensive presentation, I would encourage you to do what T. Colin Campbell recommends. He's the author of the China Study, professor at Cornell University in nutritional biochemistry, one of the most well thought of researchers in America. And recently, well, not a few years ago, he was interviewed on February 24, 2005. He's not really a Christian per se, but a member of our faith, and someone showed him, actually he picked up himself, I believe, or someone showed him some of the multiple books written by Ellen White. And he says, I'm not aware of anyone who was more on point than Ellen White. Given her background, she is truly an amazing woman. I am convinced that almost 100% of her statements are now substantially supported by the scientific evidence that has been developed during the past 2 to 3 decades. And then he went on. What I've come to realize, to even deeply worry about, is why it is that this message of Ellen White and others has been so mislaid on shelves out of sight. It is abundantly clear to me that now is the time to bring this forward in whatever way that each of us are able to do. So I ask you here this afternoon, do you want to be more intelligent? Do you want to be more analytical? Do you want to make better decisions? Do you want to have a greater capacity to empathize with others? That's also very much connected with the frontal lobe of the brain. Do you want to have better discernment? Do you want to have a greater ability to see into the future, to reason from cause to effect? Do you want to have a greater ability to overcome an addiction? That also requires an intact frontal lobe. Do you want to have a greater power to follow your conscience? And finally, do you want to be more open to understanding and doing the will of God? If you answer yes to any of these questions, I would encourage you to review your life habits and what you do on a daily basis and see what you can do to change your lifestyle to optimize your brain function, particularly the frontal lobe of your brain. Your life is in front of you, and your success and happiness in this life is directly dependent upon your ability to make those positive changes that can also help the Holy Spirit influence you to a greater degree. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel had a tremendous disappointment in his life. And verse 8 says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Daniel purposed in his heart. Another way of saying that is Daniel stepped out in faith and followed the Lord's plan. Now some people might say, well, wait a minute, we don't have the king's meat. You know, I saw right here in Sydney, Australia, Burger King. I even saw a Dairy Queen. There's a lot of royal food around here still. And so you have the choice between the royal food or what the culture is saying that you should eat, or you have a choice of purposing in your heart and, like Daniel, stepping out in faith. Verse 9 says, the Lord poured favor and tender love into the prince of the eunuchs for Daniel. And so, who was it that poured that favor and tender love? It was the Lord who poured it in response to Daniel's faith. And another word for favor and tender love is grace. So Daniel stepped out in faith, and the Lord poured grace into his life. And the Lord is wanting to pour more grace into your life. And he's just waiting for you to step out in faith and follow his plan. In 10 days, the first, in fact, the American Medical Association recently said it's the first prospective epidemiological study ever recorded in human history in Daniel chapter 1. In 10 days, they were healthier, they looked better, and in 1 year and a half, their mental acuity was far above what had ever been recorded there in Babylon. Far better than the highest IQ people, not just Daniel, but anyone who participated in Daniel's program. In fact, Ellen White says this, "Dear youth, God calls upon you to do a work which through His grace you can do. Who is she writing this to? The youth. I thought the health message was just for people that were old and starting to get disease. No, the health message was much more for the young people than it was the older people. But here's what else she says. There, show a purity of taste, appetite, and habits that bears comparison with who? Daniel's. God will reward you, she says, with 4 things. Calm nerves, a clear brain, unimpaired judgment, keen perceptions. The youth of today, whose principles are firm and unwavering, will be blessed with health of body, mind, and soul. And I'm seeing many young people take hold of this message, more than just less, fortunately, than I told you the story of to begin with, who is now in medical school, following the Lord's will, and will be powerfully used of God. The wisest man who ever lived said, "Wisdom is better than rubies." And he had lots of rubies, lots of riches. In fact, he's estimated to be the richest ever that walked the planet as far as the amount of money he had in the total monetary supply. That's how you measure wealth. And he says, if you have a choice between rubies and wisdom, what should you choose? Wisdom. And then he says, all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it. Whatever it is that your heart desires, there's something equally important or more important, and that is wisdom. I will close with a couple of statements by the pen of Ellen White. Be determined to become as useful and efficient as God calls you to be. Be thorough and faithful in whatever you undertake. Procure every advantage within your reach for the strengthening of the intellect. And then a wonderful promise that she tells us. The Lord has given man capacity for what type of improvement? Continual improvement. He's created us for the potential for continual improvement. In fact, I have to remind people sometime, the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. And so don't get discouraged. There is room for improvement for you as well. And the Lord has given you the capacity for continual improvement, has granted him all possible aid in the work. And then this very interesting statement, through the provisions of divine grace, we may attain almost to the excellence of what? Angels. Almost to the excellence of unfallen, very intelligent beings. If we step out in faith and follow the Lord's plan for continual improvement. Emotional intelligence that's also very much related to academic performance, and that has to do with motivation. Motivation is separate from IQ. But if you have motivation and you have IQ, it's very directly related to your GPA or your academic performance. Now, there are some myths about IQ that need to be cleared up here today in this subject about intelligence. One of the myths is genetics that is all that matters. Now, we do know genetics is important, and it is clear that if your mother and father had high IQ, there's a greater chance that you'll have it. But it's not at all this sole determinant of IQ. Another myth is there's nothing you can do about it after age 18. And one of the reasons why that myth is perpetuated is many 18-year-olds in America have had their IQ measured. Normally you have it measured your junior or senior year of high school, and then they will, out of curiosity, try to measure it after age 30 because they've learned so much, they're just sure that their IQ has improved. And then when they take the IQ test, they find out it's the same in most instances. It's the same, not because we're not measuring knowledge. Yes, that 30-year-old has accumulated a lot of knowledge, but it's not just accumulated knowledge. We're measuring the capacity to learn, retain, and apply new knowledge. And 30-year-olds often don't have that much greater than what they did at age 18. However, there are significant exceptions. I remember a young man who actually came in to understanding the full message of the Bible as a result of health in our town of Ardmore, Oklahoma. He came in with a vegetarian restaurant. About a year after being in Bible work, he came back to me in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and he says, you know, what I'd really like to do is to incorporate the health message with the gospel full time. I'd really like to become a doctor. And I'm thinking, Les, there's no way. There is no way. I mean, in America, I don't know how it is in Australia, but on those who try to become doctors, less than 2% will actually make it into medical school. And so you have to have a certain IQ to even be able to withstand that because of all of the information that is thrown at you in a 4-year time period that you have to learn. But he says, you know, I really have that desire. So I told him, well, listen to this. I gave him a presentation that I'm about ready to give you. And I said, incorporate it and really work on it for about a year. And I wasn't sure if it was going to be successful or not, but he had that desire, and I didn't want to say no to that desire. And so he incorporated it. He followed every aspect of the message. And then he went into the pre-med part of things, where he took chemistry and biology and physics. And at first it was a little rough, but then he started to excel more and more. And then he took his MCAT, and now he is in medical school. He made it, the top 2%, and he's having a good time in medical school. So it's a myth that there's nothing that you can do after age 18, because he was over 20 by the time he first came into the message. Another myth, people that are highly intelligent are generally irritating to be around. That has actually been studied and there and inquired more about the truths of God. He was interested in his personal health, and he adopted that lifestyle, the vegetarian lifestyle, and then he ended up becoming a fully baptized member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But he had an issue, and part of his issue was IQ. Nice-looking man, tall, handsome, great personality, but he did not do well in school. He had learned enough to learn the gospel and accept that, but he had a desire to really excel. And I remember talking to him as he was coming to me, wondering how he could excel more in school. And I told him, you know, maybe first you ought to go to a place like Mission College, where you can learn more of the deep truths of the Word of God. And he did that. He went there for 6 months, and he enjoyed his time there. But I remember calling the director of that school, Louis Torres, about halfway through the course, and I said, tell me how Les is doing. He says, you know, I'm not sure he's going to make it. He is struggling. And he's getting some of the lowest grades in our classes, but he's barely surviving. And he says, I'm hoping that he's going to pull through. And at the end, he did pull through. He actually raised his grades enough. He wasn't by any means in the top half of his class. He was in the bottom half of his class at Mission College. But he learned enough to become a Bible worker, and he went right into Bible work in Colorado. And he was a successful Bible worker. He had that winning personality and that nice appearance that went along with it, and that helped to make up maybe for some of the deficits that he had as far as his IQ was concerned. But I remember today we're going to be talking about how to enhance your intelligence. And this has a lot to do with your success in life. Psychologists tell us that the job that you get out of college is directly related to your IQ. And there's a lot of other things directly related to your IQ, including how long you live. In fact, in the new scientific studies, they're now having to put that in there. In fact, just last week, a study was done and published in the journal Circulation showing that IQ was the second most important factor to how long you're going to live, over another lifestyle factor that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So intelligence is related also to longevity and how long your success will be. What is the definition of IQ? It's your capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. All three of those things. And it's not just your capacity to learn. You have to retain it. That means you have to have a memory. The temporal lobe of the brain has to be working. And you also have to be able to apply that knowledge in your daily life. And it's often measured by an IQ test. How many of you have had an IQ test in this room? Wow, I would say the majority of Australians have not had their IQ measured. And I'm wondering why. I won't go into the possibilities as to why you haven't had yours measured. It's related somewhat to academic performance. Not completely. There is something called EQ. The studies show that although some of them are irritating to be around, they're no more likely to be irritable than people of low IQ or average IQ. So irritableness has a lot more to do with EQ than IQ, and they're not necessarily related. Another myth, people that are highly intelligent lack common sense. And this, of course, is true in some. Albert Einstein, I think, was a good example, and that's maybe how the myth was perpetuated. Albert Einstein would frequently get lost on his way home. And he would just forget about where he was at. He was deep in thought, and then he'd have to say, wait a minute, where am I? I just passed my house some time ago. And he would have to find it again. And then another myth, you can't improve it, so why try? I think we've already dispelled that myth because it can be improved upon. So let's talk about how to improve intelligence in children and in adults. Now, what I'm going to be presenting to you are things that you can do now to improve your intelligence. And, we have limited time. One of the things I would like to talk about is how you can raise your kids to be high IQ. There's an environment that's actually started in the prenatal and the natal influences, and then the first 5 years of life that are critically important to how high an IQ your own children will have. But that's a different topic, somewhat related, but it is a different topic. But that will be for another time. One is to avoid toxins. Toxins to the brain will adversely affect IQ. And alcohol actually affects a certain portion of the brain before it affects any other portion of the brain. It's called the frontal lobe of the brain. This is the area of spirituality, morality, and the will. It's the area where we make our decisions. It's the